Let's shift to the Ontario election. Ontarians will be voting in their provincial election on June 2nd. Currently, the Progressive Conservative Party of Premier Doug Ford is holding a sizable lead in the polls. Let's start with their record. Pam, what do you make of their last 4 years in power?
Well, it makes me worry about if they get another 4 years in power. I mean, they totally mishandled the pandemic. I mean, they did not treat it with the seriousness that it was. It was like they were in denial about all of the hospitals filling up, about the overworking of doctors and nurses and support staff, and the failure in the beginning to really support all of the mandates and to support vaccines and to kind of waver back and forth didn't instill confidence in anybody. Also, where have they been on the Indigenous file? They haven't been, doing too much on the Indigenous file except his threats that when it comes to the Ring of Fire, that's going to be mined if he has to jump on the bulldozer himself, which pretty much just tells First Nations that their rights and their voice doesn't matter. He's going to go ahead and breach our rights anyway. And so that doesn't bode well for First Nations. And then think about it. Up until the election, he was essentially the enemy of teachers. He was constantly calling down teachers. He seemed to be the enemy of workers. He hated unions of all kinds. He wanted to get rid of the green belt and change these ministerial zoning orders so that he could build endless highways, which, would benefit lots of other people, but not Indigenous peoples, not Ontarians. So he's going into this election with a terrible, terrible record. And I might also add, he failed to give us buck a beer.
Yeah, I think they've really fulfilled this very tired but effective slogan of theirs, which is opening up Ontario for business. As you mentioned, we've seen this pretty brutal austerity agenda that has involved rolling back $15 minimum wage. He's attacked the education sector and teachers. Really kind of like a full frontal fight with the teachers union in the middle of a pandemic. He's scrapped paid sick days initially, cut social assistance, and he's also, as the Breach has reported, been pushing privatization of healthcare. And they've also quietly lowered corporate taxes to the point now that they have drained the treasury in Ontario, making the social spending in Ontario the lowest of any province whatsoever. And as you mentioned, they've kind of given their buds in the corporate and development sector basically a free ride, whether that's in the north or pushing up green space in Ontario. Anything for more extraction, more empowerment of the resource industry in the province. And as you say, I think they probably showed their truest colors in the pandemic when, they shuttered parks, they empowered police, gave them new powers, and basically made it seem like the only priority they had was keeping corporate business, manufacturing open, regardless of the cost, especially for the lives of working class and primarily racialized peoples. So a pretty brutal record. What's been interesting is that around this time last year, Ford's polling numbers started cratering. And, his pandemic response or his pandemic mishandling really seemed to elicit widespread outrage and organizing, forcing him to reverse some of these policies. He brought back the 15 minimum wage, he removed those police powers, and he's as far as I can tell, he's tried to kind of rebrand himself again as a friend of the people.
Oh,
What would you make of that, Pam?
rebrand. What rebrand? If like the platform is very much centered on highways, billions and billions and billions for highways, and what he calls critical mineral infrastructure. So he's very much about making sure that his friends in construction and that his friends in land development get everything they need on an ongoing basis. Never mind destroy the environment. Never mind, not caring about people who have disability needs, people who have housing needs, all of these things. So, I mean, he's got a interesting video on his website about how wonderful he is. But when you look at his track record, I mean, he's always advocated to give police more money. that's in his platform. He's historically denied systemic racism and has constantly defended the police and wants to give them more power and more money. So I'm worried that people are going to forget about all of that and just look at, oh, what's he been saying in the last couple of weeks, because sometimes people have very short memories.
Yeah, and certainly the media coverage doesn't always help. We actually have a clip of him talking about how he's working for workers. Let's play this clip.
Friends, the progress we've made together in Ontario has been nothing short of extraordinary. Workers across Ontario are all different, and the type of work they do is different. But their work ethic and dedication to building this province unites all of us. That is why earlier this week, our government introduced the Working for Workers Act, our plan to build the future of our great province by taking the side of workers. A plan that will leave nobody behind.
Well, working for workers is like some Orwellian abuse of language, and also it's like a really weak sauce alliteration. I mean, they couldn't do better than working for workers. But let's break it down for a bit. They are trying to rebrand, I think, as Friends to Workers, which is kind of how he rode a wave of disenchantment with the Liberal Party to power 4 years ago. And it's been interesting to see just in the last few months them unrolling a series of initiatives that sound great in name, but in practice are actually just entrenching and continuing the kind of erosion of workers' rights. So we saw, for instance, a paid sick days program from the government, but it's temporary, it's inadequate, and it's really just an attempt to kind of block the emergence of a real employer-paid sick days program. We also saw them pass what was called a Digital Platform Workers' Rights Act. But it claims to support gig workers, but when you actually look at it, it just like entrenches the misclassification of workers. And even the childcare deal, which the Doug Ford government kind of dragged their heels on, almost as if to just be able to ink it just before the election so they could wave it around. It's the absolute worst deal in the province. It maintains childcare workers' rates at an absolute bargain basement cost. And also what it does is it sends a lot of this federal money, which was supposed to support public childcare. It is ensuring that it's actually going to be supporting the growth of much lower quality private sector childcare.
And keep in mind the hundreds of millions of dollars in federal support during the pandemic, which was critically and urgently needed as social supports and infrastructure supports, and not spending it. Like, to be so spiteful against the prime minister that you wouldn't spend it. You would demand the money. You would say they're not giving you enough, but not actually spend it. And who suffers from that? Right? We're the ones who suffer from that. And where is his Indigenous platform? Did you see? It's 2 tiny paragraphs. First Nations are going to get $1 billion to build the Ring of Fire, roads and highways into the Ring of Fire, but nothing on TRC, nothing on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, nothing on foster care, none of that stuff. In fact, not only more money for policing, but policing in very specific areas, what he calls unregulated tobacco, which is really a dog whistle for First Nation tobacco, because he has been dying to support the convenience store owners and really crack down on First Nations who've had like thousands of years of growing and manufacturing and trading in tobacco, and to trying to end that. So, all of this is a huge, huge problem. Even to date, he hasn't spent all of that COVID money. And so people really need to think about that. Will he be there for you when things continue to go bad, when things continue? I mean, we've got to think about more than just highways.
Pam, the last official debate between the leaders was held on Monday. Did you catch it? What did you think of it?
I wish there were true leaders that would focus on, here's my plan, here's how I'm going to get it done, and here's how it's going to benefit you, instead of, you're bad, no, you're bad, no, you're bad, no, you are. Come on. I mean, they could essentially just have 4 Spider-Mans sitting around all pointing at each other. It's your fault, you're bad, no, you're bad. I mean, what are they doing for Ontarians? Guess who doesn't have a platform? Doug Ford is the only one who doesn't have a platform, so you can't really critique it.
Well, and what did you think of the Liberal Party?
They have some things in there that sound, that it's moving in the right direction, but they're picking the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And ultimately, his focus for First Nations is unlocking the mineral reserves in the province of Ontario. So instead of really looking at murdered and missing Indigenous women in a holistic way and the incarceration crisis and all of these things that are really important, the focus primarily is on energy development, extraction, how to get all of the skills training for people to engage in that process. So in that way, he doesn't differ too much from Doug Ford. And that's a problem. I actually expected a lot more. Given that what you see in the Liberal platforms at the national level and in other provinces, it was a really impoverished agenda for Indigenous peoples. And then I didn't see a whole lot that give me any confidence on the environment or tackling racism in the province.
Yeah, and I'd say it's also important to remember that the Tory agenda in many ways kind of continues the Liberal agenda. We saw them, cut in their 10 years in power, cut healthcare funding. They privatized hydro. They attacked the teachers as well. And they only raised the minimum wage after there was a big movement run by the Fight for 15 and for decent work. So, and it was very much on the heels of the Liberal rule in this province that Ford was able to pass himself off as, fighting for the little man. And I've also just been struck by how the Liberal Party and the strategists in the back room, they don't actually seem in this election to be going for a victory. I think that they have been focusing a lot of their energy on trying to sideline the NDP so that they can become the opposition and position themselves as the responsible government, 4 years from now. I guess that leaves the NDP to discuss. What's your sense of how they have campaigned in opposition and are campaigning in this election?
Well, I think that, the campaign, their platform, first of all, like if you compare all of the Spider-Man's platforms, the NDP obviously is the best. They're more social oriented. They care more about the people. They care more about the environment. They care about everyday issues, which is important. I think more parties should be that way. They have a huge Indigenous reconciliation plan where they actually say the words rights, treaties, a commitment to address murdered and missing, implementing TRC recommendations, all of this stuff, self-determination, which sounds really, really good. But then if you keep reading, she too wants to unlock the critical minerals in the province of Ontario, but she wants to do it the right way. Make sure Native people get jobs out of it. Well, that is not the right way. And while Horvath does have something her platform is much stronger than the rest of them, we have to keep in mind that you can't just presume that a politician is going to implement their promises. I mean, look at the NDP when they came to power in BC. They had huge First Nations support because they were all about the people and the environment and respecting Indigenous rights and implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And what have we seen since he's been elected? We've seen the RCMP violently invade and arrest and attack Indigenous land defenders in Wet'suwet'en territory, Secwepemc territory, Haida territory, you name it. So there's a vast difference, between what's in a campaign promise and what they do at the end of the day. And that's what makes me a little bit hesitant about the NDP. It sounds great, but some of the provincial NDP governments have been some of the worst across the country, at least for Indigenous peoples.
Yeah. I'm also struck by how their platform on paper is quite good. It's certainly more left-wing and social democratic than any platform they've had in years. But they had 4 years to mobilize and amplify and channel a huge amount of outrage at Doug Ford. And I think they absolutely squandered the opportunity. They either ignored or badly amplified the demands that movements were putting on the table instead of, crystallizing and advocating for them. So it's stunning to me that they did not seize the moment that they were basically given over the last few years. And again, in this campaign, I think that we're not, apart from maybe a few individual MPPs who, like Joel Hardin and Jessica Bell and others, who are really, much more boldly campaigning, we're not really seeing Andrea Horwath put what bold policies they do have on the table. We're seeing again a kind of like, we can be a more responsible government than the Liberals or the Tories can, but they're not really speaking to the fundamental hunger that people have for change in this country and in Ontario as much as any other province.
It's a missed opportunity because they could be saying, here's our plan, here's how it's different, here's how it's going to improve things, like the how of what we're going to do. They could have been building that up, like you said, in the last 4 years. But instead now there's this mad rush and most people don't even know what's in their platform because they haven't been really good about advertising that. Yeah, it's in the platform, but not everybody's a political junkie and goes online and reads all the platforms and all the costing and all of that stuff. So, they're really relying on, what are people seeing in the media and how are they going to improve the lives of Ontarians? And they missed an opportunity to showcase how much, they're talking about human beings and Indigenous peoples and the environment and social supports, which are not just critically important right now. They're going to be increasingly important as climate change goes, as, jobs are an issue, all of those things. And it's such a missed opportunity.
I agree. Well, that's it for this segment. And just so listeners know, on June 2nd, in 2 weeks, we'll be doing a live broadcast on election night with interviews from a wide spectrum of social movement activists and thinkers in Ontario. And of course, your trusty panelists as well will be commentating. So make sure to tune in for that.